Welcome to Profound Appetit Kitchen. We're diving into a new series that we're doing, which is taking you around the world. Something that we're going to focus on different regions, talk about the culture and the cuisine, and take you through a dish that maybe would be a little less approachable for the average person, but that we're gonna make it simplified for you today. So the first region that we're diving into is France. We're gonna talk about the dish today of beef bourguignon, which sounds very complicated, I know. But this is actually a very simple dish. It's a dish that was a peasant dish that used cuts of meat that were a little bit more difficult to work with. And with the techniques that we will apply today, we're going to make this dish luxurious and tender and something that everyone desires. So join us today as we kind of take you through that process. All right, so to start off, let's talk a little bit about the ingredients that are being used today. We start off with the fat. Now, bacon is the obvious choice that everyone loves. In French times, they're not gonna have bacon because they're not gonna have smoked bacon, but they would have a version of that, which is just gonna be a pork belly. And so that's really what we're gonna be using today. We're using bacon because that's the easiest thing for us to get our hands on. And you'll see that's actually more of a fat that we use as well as an accompanying texture later in the dish. Next, we have a handful of different vegetables. We've got our onions, white onions, we've got our garlic, we've got our carrots, we've got some tomatoes. We've got some deeper flavor we're gonna get from tomato paste. Later on in the dish, we're going to end up using additional vegetables like some mushrooms, pearl onions as well. There's a number of herbs that are being used. Thyme is the most typical one that most French cooking uses. We're also gonna do an herbs to prevent, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about in depth in a few. We've got our bay leaves. We've got some flour, which is going to be used to thickening. We've got some black pepper. And then of course, we've got some sea salt. Finishing at the end, we will finish off with some parsley. And then the last thing that's really something that a lot of people miss is going to be chocolate. Yes, chocolate. Very similar to what Mexican cultures use, where they put a little bit of chocolate in mole. In this dish, just a tad of chocolate at the end adds a tiny bit of sweetness and a tiny bit of bitterness with the dark chocolate. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then the most two important pieces of the dish, number one is beef brisket. Okay, I've got about a 3.5 pound piece of beef brisket here, which we're gonna work with. There's a number of cuts of meat that you can use, so don't feel that you have to use beef brisket, but beef brisket is definitely something that works really well for this dish. I've got some beef stock. And then of course, the most important factor, wine. There's a number of wines that can be chosen, but we've actually chosen to use a Bordeaux. You can use a Burgundy wine. Obviously, it comes from the Burgundy region. Burgundy or Bordeaux would work either direction. To fortify the dish and go a little bit deeper, we actually will also add a pre-made demi-glaze. There's a couple of options for this. Typically, I like to use the more than gourmet version. This is a difficult one to get these days, and so we ended up picking up as well the sauce, which is something that will work just as well. So an important factor when you're making this dish, and any dish really, is building on flavors. And so it starts with the fat that we've chosen. We talked earlier about using bacon fat. That's the first step of our actually building a flavor. The second level is browning our meat. Very important step that you can't miss. You want to brown the meat on every single side. Now, browning the meat is going to not only give us some color, but it's also going to give us really deep depth flavor of beef flavor. That's also involving the idea of using the flour. You'll see that we're going to actually use the flour to coat the beef, which allows her to build up a fond and allows it to brown the beef better. But that also carries those bits right through into the sauce. So when we actually introduce the wine into it, we'll break down that fond, and that's all going to build up on deep, deep flavor. Of course, we've got all of our vegetables. Don't forget to salt and pepper throughout preparation and making sure that you're actually salting every step of the way. We talked a little about the tomato paste. Tomato paste is going to build on flavor. It's going to give you a deep umami flavor with that tomato. In addition, we mentioned that we were adding in a demi-glaze. The demi-glaze is going to, again, be one other level of flavor that we're adding into things. Lastly, the wine. Very important factor. I mean, what differentiates a beef bourguignon with something like a beef stew is this right here. Most beef stews don't use much wine, if any wine at all. And we're using an entire bottle of wine in this dish. So that's gonna really build a lot of flavor for us. And then lastly at the end, and this is I think that a lot of people make a mistake on, is that you don't just wanna throw everything into a slow cooker crock pot and make it all together. We're gonna actually take these mushrooms, we're gonna cook them in butter later. We're gonna make them really savory and delicious, and we're gonna put them on top of the dish at the end. Now the pearl onions are not gonna go in the pot, just like the mushrooms are not gonna go in the pot, because we don't want them to kind of cook through the entire dish. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these and we're gonna saute them with a little bit of sugar and caramelize them really beautiful at the end. Get a nice deep brown coating to them that has a nice caramelized sugary flavor. And that's gonna give you just a really great bite of a savoriness from the beef, and then that buttery mushroom flavor, and then that sweet little bite from the onion. Really rounds the entire dish up. Traditionally, this dish we use something like thyme, and we will be using thyme today. But in addition, I'm going to actually introduce using herbes de Provence. And herbes de Provence is a dried herb that's got a number of different herbs within it. So we've got basil and oregano and thyme, of course, and then bay leaves and things of that sort. So it's something that is very versatile and is used in a lot of French cooking. All right, so the next step in the process here, now that we've kind of pre-prepared everything and we've got all the vegetables in here and the meat chopped up, is to put our herbs in here as well. And this is the pre-marinade. You want to do this probably, best case, 24 hours before, but worst case, if you can do this even 3 or 4 hours before cooking the dish, this will make a huge difference. So I've got some fresh thyme, I'm gonna put that in there. I talked a little bit earlier about the herbes de Provence, which is what this is. I'm just gonna put a teaspoon or so of this in here as well. It's something that will kind of add a nice fortified deep flavor. I've got a couple of bay leaves, which the herbes de Provence has bay leaves in it as well, but we're just gonna add a couple more of those in here. Got a couple of black peppercorns, which I'm gonna throw in here. And then of course a little bit of sea salt. Once all of that is in, we're going to marinate that with an entire bottle of wine. Now, you don't wanna use a cooking wine. You wanna use a wine that you would normally drink, something that you would have no problem drinking with the meal. In fact, I would recommend that you actually serve this with the meal. Get a couple bottles and have it ready to go. This one is pre-marinated and all set to go, and you can see the color on it there. It's kind of really broken down where I've got a little bit of a different creaminess color to the actual wine, and it's really marinated everything through. The onions are all gonna be nice and red. The meat's gonna be saturated with this wine. The vegetables are gonna be really well saturated as well. What I've done is I've separated all 3 of the items out of the marinade. I've took the vegetables and set them aside. I've taken the broth, the wine, and set that aside with the herbs. And I've taken the meat and set that aside. Now I've dried the meat with some paper towels because I want this to be a little bit drier. And then what I also did prior as well, just to kind of get a head start, is I've also cooked down our bacon. So I chopped our bacon up into small pieces and I fried that off so that I can have the fat to work with. I'm gonna save the bacon for later because that's gonna actually go on top of the dish at a later time. So now let's focus on what we're doing with the meat to get this prepared a little further. The first step is that we're going to want to introduce some flour and some salt into this. So I'm gonna grab a pinch of salt here, sprinkle this through. And then flour is gonna depend on how much meat we actually have, because you may start with 3 pounds, you may start with 4 pounds. I'm gonna start with just throwing in somewhere in the area of 3 tablespoons or so. And then I want to mix that. You got to get your hands in here and just mix that all around with the salt and the flour. The ultimate goal is going to be to have every piece completely coated. Grab maybe another 1.5 tablespoons or so. So we're at probably about 1/4 cup of flour at this point. Now this is going to help to allow the meat to brown, but it's also going to help to thicken the sauce later. So it's a very important step. You don't want to miss this step. It looks like that's pretty good. So that's kind of what we look like right now. And now we're finally going to move on to the cooking process. So join me over at the stove. So the tools of the trade right now, I've got a spoon. This is going to be used for a number of things, really scrubbing things off and pushing things around, and tongs. Very important to have tongs. So we'll set them aside at the moment. I've got my rendered fat from earlier that I had done the bacon with. I'm going to put that into a hot pan. I've got a couple tablespoons here to get started. I'm going to let that heat up nice. I want this to be nice and hot, so I've got my temperature up pretty high. And then I'm going to introduce my marinated beef that's got flour already on it. Now with this, it's got to brown on all sides. So we want to make sure that we don't crowd the pan too much. So depending on the size of the pan you have will depend on how much you can fit at one time. We're going to want to do this in batches. So I'm going to drop the pieces in, make sure they're all separated. And I'm going to very carefully keep an eye out. We don't want to burn them, but we do want to get them browned on all sides. So we're going to pay attention to make sure we flip them all over as they need to be flipped. And in this size pan, it looks like I'm going to probably get away with probably around somewhere between 2 to 3 batches total. So I have about 15 or 16 pieces of beef in here right now. So the finished product of our meat, we really want it to look like this. Nice brown bits, and you're going to want something to catch the juices when you put it on, so I put it on a plate that has a tall lip. Those are all flavor things that we want to keep. So my temperature's still on medium. You can see I'm starting to smoke. Now I'm going to actually put my vegetables right in. There's a little residual liquid in them, and that's okay, that'll steam off. And now I go to the spoon. And the liquid that's in there is actually going to help deglaze the pan a bit to get some of the caramelization and the fond off the bottom of the pan. Now in this step, I do want to add a little salt. So I'm going to take it and put a tiny bit of salt in there. And there's a few reasons for this, but the main thing is it's going to help sweat down the vegetables a bit. And the second thing is that you always want to season at every single level. Now all these black bits in the bottom that got scraped up are going to regenerate, but now with vegetable fond built into them as well. So we're going to start to see more brown that's generating on the bottom of the pan, and that's all flavor. That's how we get such a deep, rich taste. That's how we get deep, rich color. Now the next part of this process is I'm going to actually put some tomato paste in. We're going to go for about 2 tablespoons or so, maybe a little bit more. This adds a bit of an acidity, it adds a depth of flavor, and it's also going to help create an additional fond on the bottom. So we're going to mix that within. And we'll let that cook down a tiny bit. And I'm also going to throw in our tomatoes. And again, back to the salt, just a tiny bit of salt. Always salt every single level. And mix them within. You can start to see the fond that's developing on the bottom. Now it's got a little bit of a red tone from that tomato paste in there. And then what I like to do at this point is actually throw in the actual fortified stock or bouillon or whatever you may have. If you have bouillon, this is a demi-glaze that's pre-created. You can see how thick that is. So basically somebody in the factory created veal demi-glaze, and then they reduced it down to the point where you can, with 1 tablespoon, you can get a lot of flavor. So I'm going to put that in there as well. Try to get as much of that off as I can. It just adds another depth of flavor into this whole thing. Now, it's not going to take away from the beef. It's just adding to it and just complementing it further. That's looking pretty good. So now we move to our wine.
And we're gonna wanna add our wine in. The wine that we used for our marinade before, we're gonna pour that right in here. With the herbs that we had in there, we'll let that go. And we want that to reduce by half. Now, I'm gonna scrape the bottom again because I wanna get this fond off. You can see the fond on the side of the pan. And as I get the liquid hitting it, and the hot liquid is going to melt that right off, and that's gonna be flavor. So we're picking up all that flavor into this dish just by scraping all that off. And all the bits that are on the bottom of the pan are all stuck there as well, so you wanna scrape with your metal or your wood spoon and get all that off as well. So we're gonna bring that to a boil. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and add our beef back in. Again, we're going to want this to reduce. Now, something I forgot to talk about earlier is the type of pot that we're cooking in. So let's talk a little bit about that. This is a Dutch oven, and there's a number of Dutch ovens you can get. You've probably seen the traditional camping style Dutch oven that has cast iron finish to it. This one has a ceramic finish to it. And the ceramic finish allows it to be non-stick and just gives you a little bit of a better experience when it comes to cooking in modern day times. So it's a more modern day version of what they would have used years ago. The benefit of this is that it's extremely thick cast iron, so it's going to hold the heat. So it's going to act like an oven. So when we throw this in the oven, it's going to concentrate that heat, the temperature that we put it at, which will be around 350 degrees. It'll concentrate that heat real up close to this dish and really braise it real nice. Okay, so we're coming to a boil now. We want to leave that boil a little bit, and again, we want to cook some of that liquid down, so we're going to just leave that go and leave that boil. So I've already scraped most of the stuff off the side. More is going to get generated, but that's okay. All right, let's see how we look. So we've reduced by probably almost a half, pretty close to that. It's definitely a lot more thickness, and you can see how thick it is, and it's thickened because of the flour that we had put in originally. That's part of why it's thickened. We have a nice rolling bubble. And let's go ahead at this point and add in a box of broth or stock. So we've got beef broth or beef stock. And we're just going to mix that in, bring it up to a simmer. And once we come up to a simmer, we're going to go ahead and put it right into the oven. 350 degree oven for about 4 hours, but you're going to want to pay attention because sometimes it takes a little more, sometimes it takes a little less. You don't want it burning. You want to be very thoughtful of that. So check it every 30 to 45 minutes and just make sure you stir it a bit, make sure that it looks like it's in good shape and that it's not burning at all or sticking to the bottom. All right, and so now we got our 350 degree oven. I did have a pan in there. I do find that to be a little bit better in case you have an overfilled pot that wants to spill out. It doesn't burn the bottom of your stove and then cause it to smoke. And I'm gonna take my cast iron, put it in. It's quite heavy at this point, so be very careful not to hurt yourself when you're lifting it in. Slide it in 350 degrees for somewhere about 4 hours, but give or take, you wanna check it every 30 minutes or so. And then somewhere around the 3 hour mark, you can go ahead and introduce putting your chocolate in and mix that in. You're gonna put just a couple of ounces of chocolate, so probably what equates to about 15 or 20 of these little nubs if you're buying it like this. If you're buying it as a chocolate bar, then probably about a half of the chocolate bar size. And break that up, drop it in, and mix it around. It will mix in nicely. It adds a little nice depth of flavor. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna just put together some scratch potatoes because that is the perfect thing to go with beef bourguignon. I've boiled some potatoes, they're in here, I've skinned them. I didn't go too crazy with skinning them too perfectly. I left a little bit of skins on them, I left a little bit of knots in them because this is a very rough potato recipe. I don't really care too much about whether this is going to have lumps. And sometimes I really like that little bit of flavor of lumps in there, the little bit of texture that you get from that. So we're gonna kind of take this very, very rough, on purpose. So I'm using just a standard hand masher, which is just going to push everything through it. Again, it's not going to get the typical clean French perfect mashed potato. If you don't have one of these, you can just get away with just using a fork and just mashing a fork off to the side of the container. Now to soften this a bit, I've got a couple of things. I want to actually have a little bit of a garlic mashed potato flavor. So earlier I threw a couple of heads of garlic in the oven and I roasted them, and that's what I have here. So I'm going to grab a little bit of that right now and squeeze a little bit of that in here. So if I grab one of my roasted garlics and I just squeeze that out, I'm going to squeeze out the nice sweet pieces of garlic into here. And we're going to mash that up within here as well. It's not going to be any real intense flavor, just going to add a background note of garlic. And then additionally, I've gone and been on the stovetop. I've had some heavy cream, some butter, and some thyme, just kind of slowly steeping there so we can get that flavor infused. So I'm going to pour that in here. I'm going to pick the pieces of thyme out as we go, so I don't have any big chunks of thyme in here. And then the last thing is, because we're in Philadelphia, and I know this is not traditional, we're going to do some Philadelphia cream cheese, because Philadelphia cream cheese always makes potatoes better. So I've got a bit of that in there. And then lastly, we just go ahead and mix. I'm going to season this with salt and pepper to taste. Once I start to kind of work through the taste of it and figure out what I'm looking for. And then from a texture perspective, we're just going to continue to mash this up till it hits the right texture. We're going to break up some of these potatoes a bit more so that we get just the right texture. So I'm going to go back to my masher, since the masher is doing a little bit of a better job. Now notice I have not added any salt in yet. I'm waiting until the end so I can taste it, see what I want it to taste like at that point. I'm going to grab my sea salt, put in probably for this setting, at least a tablespoon. And then I'm going to mix that up again. And to taste again to make sure it's where I want it to be. And it's perfect. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to prep our mushrooms. I've got a little bit of butter in the bottom of a saute pan. Mushrooms tend to soak up butter, so we want to make sure that we have enough of them in there that we actually get the flavor that we're looking for. So the first thing I do is I got some butter going, dump our mushrooms in. I prepared these ahead of time. And then I also have, to fortify the flavors that we've already been putting into the dish, I've got a little bit of thyme. Toss a little bit of thyme on top. This will end up leaching into the flavor of the butter. It'll be great. The last thing is I want to make sure I salt this. Okay, so again, we're seasoning at every level. So I've got a couple of pinches of salt that I put in here. And I'm going to leave this start to cook down. It'll start to reduce. It'll start to get some color. We're probably, again, going to have to add more butter because I know that it's going to soak up this butter as it is. Be careful in the beginning, because in the beginning it's all going to want to fall out of the pan, but it will eventually soften up and break down a bit, and then you'll have a much smaller amount in here. All right, I think that's probably about what we're looking for on that split. The nice color. So I'm sure when some of you saw these brown mushrooms early on, you thought, color? How are we going to add color to a brown mushroom? But we did, right? We added some really beautiful caramelization and some color on each of these pieces. That's what's going to bring out the flavor, and that's where we're really going to get the intensity. So I think we're pretty good on those. All right, and next I'm going to get our onions prepared. And you want to do this step just before you serve. Same thing with the mushrooms. So I'm just doing a tiny bit of butter. I've got frozen onions, pearl onions, that you can get them fresh, but they're seasonal. So this time of year, we can only get frozen. Again, like everything, I'm going to season them a little bit. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and add some water into this because I want to cook these through before they caramelize. So just enough to kind of cover them. And then the last thing and the most important step of this process is that we want to add some sugar. And so I'm going to add probably about 3 teaspoons or so, maybe a little bit more. And we'll leave that go. That's going to cook down a bit. And for the sake of cooking that quick, I'm going to throw the lid on top of this and let that cook. Okay, so now, as you can see, we're cooking down. We're also starting to get a little color on it. That's what we want. Ultimately, at the end, we want every piece to have a brown that you're seeing on the tips of each of those pieces. And that'll happen when the caramelization from the sugar starts to actually brown a bit. Now, we're okay to walk away for a period of time while the liquid's cooking off, but once we get to this point where the bubbles are really fine, that means the sugar is starting to intensify, which means we're going to burn a lot easier. So we need to stay close by. We need to regularly mix it, move it around. You can just use a spoon to stir it a bit. All the onions are cooked all the way through. They're basically translucent. And so now it's going to be caramelizing them, which again is going to happen once all the water cooks off and it's left with just the sugar and the liquid from the onions itself. So this happens very fast at this point in the process. Now things are going to move very fast. We got all the liquid for the most part cooked out. We're going to start to brown extremely fast. And we got to be very careful and watch this. The difference between browning and burning is a very fine line. And if you burn it, it will add a bitterness that you don't want in your dish. You can already see I'm starting to get some nice warm brown colors on this. Trying to keep the surface area where as many onions are touching the bottom as possible. Bring my temperature down just a tiny bit so I have a little bit more control. So we're probably talking no more than about 15 or so seconds per side. And then we want to be moving it and flipping it. You can see we've already got some brown on the other side. And flipping it nice. Keeping it moving. Again, flatten it out to a flat surface. We're getting a little bit more color to it. Again, we're at about 15 seconds and we do some flipping. Now we're getting a lot more brown. And move it all around to pick up whatever residual is on the pan. Now we're going to start moving it down to maybe every 10 seconds or so. We're going to flip it. Again, we don't want to burn this. You can start to see how the sides are getting a little bit dark. Shows you how fast that caramelization happens. You can smell it a little bit too, so now we're down to every 5 seconds or so before we flip. Getting the kind of color we want. And I think we're really close to being done. I'm going to hit the temperature off completely. Let it sit in that pan for a second. And that's pretty much what we want. And that's good. Now we want to get it off the heat completely. If you leave it in there, it will continue to cook. And that's it. All right, and then the last thing we're up to is, of course, the plating. Presentation matters. So what I have done is I've taken 2 spoons and I quenelle, where it's a technique where you can scoop up and then scoop again and continue that until you can get the exact shape of a really beautiful lobe of mashed potatoes. And I've layered 4 of them on there. And then I've simply given each person a plating, making sure everybody has a carrots at least, if not 1 or 2. Of course, topping it with bacon, topping it with mushrooms, and then topping it with our onions. So the perfect bite should be that crispiness of the bacon, sweetness that you get from the onion, that really great butteriness from the actual mushroom that's done, and then of course the potato and the soft meat at that point. So it should have a really
complete flavor. Thanks for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed this recipe, and hopefully it's a little bit more approachable for people who maybe find that a little intimidating to do French cooking. You'll see that it's extremely simple. You just go through the simple steps, and everybody can create a plate that looks just as good.